Yes. Vampires. Definitely one of the most common mythos out there, and still loved by horror fans today. They're known for their mix of power and the horror factor, but there are cases of them being romanticized, even sexually. Even for depictions of them frankly making little to no sense to me. There are a countless amount of depictions of them for certain fan bases, and I can't imagine the rabbit hole if you include books. I was always a fan of them because of their history, specifically their inspiration with a real person, Vlad the Impaler, who by the way I have his soil in my house. Yeah, I know, bad idea. Now, what if I told you that out of all the vampire films I watched, and perhaps some shows included, there's one that's very obscure. I know, that isn't the most shocking news. I mean, who knows how many vampire films are out there? Many would fall underneath the radar. But, what if said films are legendary? Cut to the Subspecies films. Now, the films themselves aren't the focus on this video, so they'll only get a quick mention. They contain quite a few throwback to 60s goth elements to the goth elements of the time. Basically a conglomerate of B-horror. The first part is the weakest, but is more of an introduction. It introduces the vampire Radu quite well, especially with the fantastic opening. And I love the fact that it almost came across as an ethnographic film, showcasing the culture of Romania, not unlike something in Eggers' Nosferatu, which I guess showed how vast his research was. On top of that, despite the violence and nudity, everything just feels so cozy about it. The second part is when it really shines. It mostly follows another goth, and the atmosphere is absolutely insane thanks to the framing of a few shots, not to mention the use of shadows and the overall color grading. Part 3 aims for an almost comedic approach that came across as a disastrous vampire hunting sitcom. It feels like a lot less effort was involved, which might have actually been the case as it was filmed at the same time as Part 2. But still, it was so much fun. Then, Part 4 was absolutely absurd of how dramatic and funny it was. I mean, there's a doctor named Dr. Blood. Part 5 came out quite recently, which is a prequel, and it still worked well despite everyone looking a lot older, and despite the gap in release dates, it still felt like something that would have came out around the same time as the rest of the series. Now, what if I told you that Radu in those films is actually the greatest vampire in all of cinema? I don't mean that in hyperbole. I also don't mean that in the sense that he's the greatest in all aspects. In fact, on the contrary, what I mean is that he is either the worst or the best, or second in either end of the spectrum, and is never a middling vampire. Because what's worse than a forgettable vampire? To prove this, I have been brainstorming and asking other people for help, and the end result, there are certain criteria that makes a vampire special in the media. In the end, there are 11 of them. And yes, this involved spreadsheets. I went deep into this. I know it doesn't look like a huge spreadsheet, but this gets rid of the middling sections to make it look more organized. It's shown in the thumbnail, but the following vampires are covered. Radu, that's obvious. The Orlocks. There are 3 versions of them. Plot-wise they are familiar, but I find that they each give their own distinctions and certain criteria, so I may separate them depending on the case. The Salvatore brothers, the ones everyone simps for, maybe even more than the Cullens. Vampire Diaries is an absolutely absurd show, I might add, where every episode feels like a season finale, especially with their childish issues. I actually covered the video game a while back. Interview with a Vampire. I will specifically cover the TV show as it's easily the best, although Queen of the Damned comes close in certain aspects. Dracula. There are many iterations of it. I didn't include the Dracula 3D one, but will give it a shout out. It'll make sense. The ones I ended up choosing are Bela Lugosi's and Blade Trinity's depictions, as they're stuff that falls into an extreme. Life Force. I guess they wouldn't necessarily be considered vampires as they don't have fangs, but they utilize similar tactics, and the book is literally called Space Vampires. Not to mention that their true form is a bat. And finally, this is unknown to most, but it makes a lot of views on YouTube, and I'm sure it's because a lot of gay men thought this was going to be porn. Vampires, Brighter in Darkness, specifically Lucas. This film is hilarious, and the summary is that it's basically you going into a tabletop session of Vampire the Masquerade. Yes, I know this means that it's not going to include Celine from Underworld. I know that she was every millennial sexual awakening, yes, I know. But in the criteria I've used, she is pretty much the opposite of Radu every time except maybe the first one. So, what's the point of including her? Unfortunately, this will spoil some things, but it's more about him rather than the films. So hopefully you'll still be convinced to see the films after seeing this. Or not turning off the video now. Or turning this video off now, watching the films, and then coming back to see this. That's a good idea too. So, without further ado, let's jump into the criteria. Criteria number 1. Parent issues. Basically, mommy and daddy issues. It was hard to think of competition for this one. There is the kid in Interview with a Vampire, which is basically the classic case of a toxic couple thinking that bringing a kid into it would fix everything, and it always goes about as well as you'd expect. There are the Salvatore brothers as well. They had their love triangle with Catherine, but then their dad goes on a vampire killing spree and kills her as well, with the brothers obviously being scarred from that and are always against him. However, Radu wins with this. The opening shows his daddy issues with them beefing over something that he should have acquired, the Bloodstone, which will be mentioned in other criteria. However, it's the mommy issues that shine the most. He kills his dad just to impress his mom, does the full-on "Mommy." It is clear that he is in a completely controlling relationship with her, and he becomes more obvious when you see one other criteria later on, and it's what makes these films entertaining. The summary of it is that it's basically Psycho. Because of this, Radu wins.
Yay!
Criteria number 2. Talents. This comes down to stuff like transformation, flying, mind control, etc. Lots of them can have single talents like super strength, mind control, or transforming into a giant praying mantis. However, in the grand scheme of things, these are all middling talents. The Orlocks are definitely up there, as you can see with Hult's character that he controlled his mind to open the door, and with the way that he can travel around with the use of shadows. Radu also falls into an extreme. He can travel by shadows, travel when it's like almost daytime, basically sunrise and sunset, but in the shot it's clearly daytime. But the big one that may not be seen as big on the surface is that he can summon minions. In part 1, he does that by breaking his fingers off, but in part 3, they are summoned with his blood, and believe me, this stuff is a huge game changer for him. I think Radu beats the Orlocks over this, because although he doesn't have mind control, the minions are honestly better. However, there's one type of vampire that wins in the end. The ones in Life Force. Basically, they are made by the true image that someone wants inside of their head. So, in that case, it was a good-looking naked woman, and everyone is just transfixed by her beauty. However, she can transform into other humans, which honestly would make her first place already. But that's not all. The city turned into zombies. All of this is mostly done by her and with the help of 2 other ones. 3 of them causing this much damage is insane. Sure, Orlok did the plague, but that was by him bringing the rats along, not actually doing the plague himself. This puts Radu at 2nd place, but still, I'd call that a success.
Yay!
Criteria number 3, combat. This comes down not to utilizing the talents, but rather fighting itself. Now, most of them do a fantastic job, and even the worst Draculas, for example, can still kill off quite a few people, and the only time they struggle is with Van Helsing, who is a professional. This just came down to 2 people. There is Lucas from Vampires Brighter in Darkness. Remember when I said it feels like a tabletop? This is because most of the combat comes down to them going like, "You'll never defeat me." And it's pretty much just like a battle cats would have, except in the end they would just shove each other. However, later on you could see some of them utilize more magical properties, which can make them defeat witches or even scorpions. Radu, on the other hand, he can kill innocents, but that's mostly thanks to his stealth with his shadow traveling. so I don't think that counts. The sword fight in part 1 was incredibly sad, as both of them are absolutely awful at swordplay, and he still somehow loses. In every other part, he is defeated by people who have clearly never fought a day in their lives. It's tough to say, but I have to give the edge to Radu, because part 5 is based 500 years before, and he is literally a part of the monster hunting crusades. He should know better.
Yay!
Criteria number 4, death. This comes down to how hard it would be to kill that vampire. Despite the power of some of them, many of them have a lot of ways to die. Usually sunlight and being hurt by holy water and crucifixes. This includes Radu. However, this goes in absolutely absurd parts. Now, this is talking about the end of some of his films, so skip this part if you want to avoid them. So, in the first part, he dies from the usual stake and decapitation. Normally that'd be enough, right? However, this is why I mentioned it before. His minions. They are actually able to reattach his head. Part 2, he gets stabbed with a special weapon, which you think would be over, but his mom summons him. Maybe not fully fair, but it shows what great lengths they would have to go to kill him. If you think that's silly, wait for part 3. He gets burned in the sunlight, completely impaled, and melts into a blob. But the blob includes his blood, which again turns into his minions, and again revives him. See, any vampire would rather have that over mind control. The ones in Life Force seem difficult to kill as well, with the ancient sword, but outside from that, that's it. I think it's obvious who the winner is.
Yay!
Criteria number 5, acting. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean good acting. I'm aiming for more memorable. Most of the performances are quite decent, but one factor I like for a lot of them is melodrama. The Orlocks should get a shout out for that. The latest one for a more legit performance, I guess you can say, but the first one had something special. Bela Lugosi is an obvious one where even his death stare is quite amusing. Lestat is just fantastic for melodrama. Lucas is also worth mentioning. He's very monotone in the funniest way. Seeing him speak foreign languages legit sounds like someone who's reading it out loud for the first time, and his accent is just vaguely European. However, Radu easily wins with this. Just his intro of walking in is hilarious. All the faces he makes in the distance, or his close-up when he's trying to bite someone. However, his voice is easily the best.
I'll make sure to treat her with special care.
I laughed almost every time he showed up, especially in part 2. It adds so much to these films. He's easily the winner.
Yay!
Criteria number 6, attractiveness or lack thereof. You think this one would be tough. I mean, a lot of them are attractive, especially if you're bi or pan. Sure, some may be ugly to me personally, but I can see the appeal to some of them through a more conventional approach. But Radu does not fit into that. So we have to look at the ugliest vampire. It basically just comes down to 2 vampires. With Radu, his mom is a witch who looks like a zombie, and his dad looks like Bram Stoker's Dracula, so it makes sense that he looks like this. With his half-brother, you can tell which half is different by the eyebrow difference. The competition would have to be the Orlocks. I'd go with the nudist iteration, as although he looks like your average Russian quite often, he's also literally decomposing. It's a tough competition, but at least Radu is more of a live being, I guess you could say. Because of that, Eggers' Nosferatu wins. But still, that's second place, I guess, or second lost for Radu. That's still a success.
Yay!
Criteria number 7, relationships with other vampires. Again, Radu is at the opposite end of the spectrum, so we have to go for the lowest. With Radu, he does have his consorts, like Dracula, but they clearly hate him, at least most of the time. Even the ones he had since medieval times. For example, Ash. He is reluctant to let him stay in his place, and only sees him as a necessity. Orlok would be Radu's only competition. He is by himself. With that, he once again wins, but it's still a success for Radu.
Yay!
Criteria number 8, relationships with humans. Dracula and Orlok can be considered here on the lowest end of the spectrum. However, they have their own servants in some iterations, and the estate people. Radu is literally by himself. He wins.
Yay!
Criterion number 9, relationship obsessions. This could include stuff like parent issues. However, I tried to separate it with other beings or vampires. It makes sense when you consider these ones. Orlok is worth mentioning because of how obsessed he is over a British woman, but it's not nearly good enough. There is the Salvatore brothers. They had that obsessed love triangle with Catherine, and both of them started simping for Elena because she looks exactly the same. This means that they didn't get over a girl that they knew for around 200 years. With Radu, there's Michelle. There's only one critic review for Part 4 on Rotten Tomatoes, and it literally says, "Get over her, dude." However, Part 5 is one that goes into absurdity. There's a woman there that looks exactly like Michelle. This implies that, like with the Salvatore brothers, he had this obsession for centuries. But that's medieval times. 500 years beats 200. So, Radu is the winner.
Yay!
Criterion number 10. Self-sufficiency with finances and shelter. Basically, how they are able to stay in their place, and no matter where to be able to live in the human world, or just by themselves for forever. There are cases like Underworld where they do have those giant bases, but I wouldn't say those count, as that is more self-sufficiency for the group, not for one being. Dracula, Orlok, and Lestat are tied to me. They have their own shelter and are clearly independently wealthy enough to purchase other properties. There's also Radu, who A, owns his own castle, B, theoretically can go to his mom's place, and C, was sort of getting royalties from Ash, which if you see the spin-off film Vampire Journals, shows how well off he actually was. That means he has 3 places to stay. However, that doesn't make him first place. The ones in Life Force would win, in my opinion. They can go into suspended animation, so nothing is needed, and it shows that if they're able to go in space, then they can definitely be fine of rations. Finances are literally never needed either, as if they can transform into other beings, they can use whatever shelter and currency they require. They absolutely destroy anyone else, but that makes Radu second place, so another success for him.
Yay!
And the last criteria, blood access. A lot of vampires need blood. Some have blood banks, and some just take it from humans. Some are fantastic at doing this, but it's still difficult for them. In this case, there are only 2 vampires I can think of that do it well. Dracula in Blade Trinity is actually quite well off. Blade stumbles upon a literal blood farm, people in a comatose state whose purpose is to be drained of their blood while still keeping them alive. This is an amazing resource for vampires. Radu has a more old school approach. Technically it's awful. When he bites people firstly, if it's a woman, he needs one boob to be exposed, and when he actually does bite them, he drools out like half of the blood. Hell, sometimes he doesn't even need to be doing anything and he just starts drooling. But there is the Bloodstone. This is the blood of the saints, and from what I could tell, the power is that it's a never-ending source of blood. Yes, with this stone, he is good for life.
Yay!
I hope I've presented a convincing case here as to why he reaches an extreme in every case when it comes down to vampirism. And that is what makes a watchable and memorable vampire to me. Are there any criteria that I might have missed? If so, I'll be happy to discuss where he's placed there. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this, and if you haven't seen his films yet, I hope this will make you want to. They have to be more popular.